My name is Dr. Marla Duval, and I used to believe that silence was the cruelest sound in the universe, that when the voices we love most are suddenly taken from us, what remains is an emptiness so complete it swallows every other sound, every prayer, every desperate plea for just one more conversation. I thought that when heaven stops answering, it means no one is listening anymore, that grief creates a kind of spiritual deafness that makes connection impossible. I was wrong. Some silences aren't empty spaces waiting to be filled. They're frequencies we haven't learned to hear yet, songs being sung in languages our hearts understand even when our minds reject their possibility. The night she came into my life had been unusually still, wrapped in the kind of silence that feels unnatural in a world designed to hum with constant motion. Not a breeze stirring the trees outside my clinic, not a siren wailing in the distance, not even the night birds that usually provided a gentle soundtrack to my insomnia. Since losing my daughter Cassie 18 months earlier, I'd grown accustomed to spending these sleepless hours on the back porch of the veterinary clinic I'd inherited from my father, staring at horizons where storm clouds gathered but never broke, hoping for signs that felt increasingly like foolish superstition. The faith that had once anchored my life had cracked under the weight of unanswered prayers, under the terrible mathematics of a world where 17-year-old girls could die in car accidents while drunk drivers walked away without a scratch. I found myself watching the sky more than sleeping, caught between hoping for some divine communication and dreading what form it might take. The God who had once felt like a loving father now seemed either absent or indifferent, leaving me alone with questions that grew heavier with each passing day. Then came the howl that changed everything. Long, low, piercing through the artificial silence like a blade cutting silk. Not the sound of pain or distress that I'd grown accustomed to hearing in my line of work, but something else entirely. A calling, a communication directed toward something I couldn't see or understand. The sound raised the hair on my arms and sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. The call came from Tommy Rodriguez, a 16-year-old who spent his after-school hours exploring the hills behind the old St. Mary's Church ruins, searching for artifacts and adventure in equal measure. His voice carried that particular quality of bewilderment that comes when the familiar world presents something that doesn't fit into known categories. Dr. Duval, there's a dog up behind the church. She's been there for 2 days now, pacing along the ridgeline and howling at the sky. Not at the moon, not at other dogs, just straight up at the clouds like she's trying to talk to something. And the weird part is, he paused, his young voice dropping to a whisper, sometimes it sounds like something's howling back. I met her at dawn, when the morning mist still clung to the hillsides and the world felt suspended between night and day. She was exactly where Tommy had said she'd be. A white husky mix with markings that looked like smoke against snow, standing with her muzzle pointed toward the cloud-heavy sky. Her fur was soaked with dew, but she didn't seem to notice the cold or the moisture. She was completely focused on something above her, something invisible to my earthbound perception. As I watched, she threw back her head and howled again, her eyes closed in concentration, her entire body rigid with the effort of projection. The sound that emerged from her throat was unlike anything I'd heard from any dog in 23 years of veterinary practice. It had harmonics, overtones that seemed to vibrate in my chest cavity and resonate in spaces I didn't know existed within my body. When she finished, she opened her eyes and looked directly at me. Not the cautious assessment of a feral animal evaluating a potential threat, but something that felt disturbingly like recognition, as if she'd been waiting for me specifically and was pleased that I'd finally arrived for our appointment. "What are you looking for up there, beautiful?" I whispered, approaching slowly with my hands visible and non-threatening. She tilted her head slightly, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, then turned and began walking down the hill toward my truck. Not fleeing or following, but leading, as if she'd decided our business lay elsewhere and expected me to accompany her to whatever destination she had in mind. The drive back to my clinic passed in unusual quiet. Most rescue animals filled transport time with whimpering, panting, or other signs of stress, but she simply arranged herself in the carrier and watched the landscape pass by with the patient attention of a seasoned traveler. It wasn't until we reached the clinic and I was settling her into a kennel that her behavior became truly extraordinary. My staff named her Nova before I had a chance to object, drawn to the celestial quality of her presence, and the way she seemed to generate her own internal light, even in the fluorescent glare of the clinic's interior spaces. She refused food and water with polite disinterest, showed no curiosity about toys or comfort items, but moved through her kennel space with obvious purpose, always positioning herself beneath the skylight or near windows that offered the clearest view of the sky. Most remarkably, she maintained a precise schedule that defied explanation. Every night at exactly 3:33 a.m., she would position herself in the center of her kennel, lift her muzzle toward the ceiling, and howl with the same focused intensity I'd witnessed on the hill. The sound would last for approximately 3 minutes, then stop abruptly, as if she'd completed some essential communication and could rest until the next scheduled transmission. She avoided reflective surfaces with obvious distaste, turning away from mirrors and water bowls that might show her own image. She showed no interest in the radio or television, but there was one stimulus that consistently captured her attention. When I sang softly to myself, particularly an old hymn called "Be Thou My Vision," that Cassie used to hum during our long car rides to her astronomy club meetings, Nova would lift her head and listen with an attention so complete it made me self-conscious about my untrained voice. It was during her first thorough physical examination that I discovered something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. She submitted to the procedures with unusual cooperation, showing no fear of the thermometer or stress response to needle pricks. But when I gently opened her mouth to examine her teeth and gums, I stepped back so quickly I nearly knocked over the instrument tray. The roof of Nova's mouth bore an intricate pattern that defied medical explanation. Not scar tissue from injury or the random discoloration that sometimes occurs in animal oral cavities, but a design of deliberate complexity that looked like it had been burned into her tissue with surgical precision. Tiny dots connected by curved lines, creating geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly and seemed to shift when observed from different angles. My first thought was that someone had deliberately tortured this animal, had branded her palate with heated instruments for reasons too cruel to contemplate. But as I studied the markings more carefully, forcing myself to overcome my initial revulsion, I realized they weren't random marks of abuse. They formed a coherent pattern, a map of sorts, with reference points and connecting lines that suggested purpose rather than sadism. The design reminded me of something I'd seen before, though I couldn't immediately place the memory. It wasn't until I was driving home that evening that recognition hit me like a physical blow. The pattern was nearly identical to a star chart I'd found in Cassie's astronomy notebook after her death, one of dozens of meticulous drawings she'd made during her final year, as she'd grown increasingly fascinated with pulsar signals and deep space navigation. That night, driven by a combination of scientific curiosity and desperate hope, I photographed the markings in Nova's mouth and sent them to Dr. James Morton, an old friend who worked at the University Observatory. I kept my message brief, asking only, "What does this look like to you?" His response came within 10 minutes, fast enough to suggest he'd dropped whatever he was doing to examine the image. "This is a fragment of a pulsar map, but not one from any catalog I'm familiar with. The mathematical relationships are correct, but the referenced pulsars aren't in our databases. Where did you get this? And why does it appear to be burned into organic tissue?" I didn't answer his questions, couldn't have explained them even if I'd wanted to. Instead, I spent that night at the clinic, watching Nova through the observation window and trying to understand what I was dealing with. At exactly 3:33 a.m., she began her nightly ritual, positioning herself beneath the skylight and howling toward whatever destination called to her in frequencies I couldn't detect. But this time, something responded. The fluorescent lights above her kennel dimmed and began pulsing in rhythm with her vocalizations, even though they weren't connected to any dimmer system. More impossibly, the old PA speaker in the break room, which had been disconnected for months, suddenly crackled to life and emitted 3 distinct tones: high, low, then high again, each lasting exactly the same duration as Nova's howls. When her communication session ended, she turned to look directly at the observation window where I was standing, her pale eyes reflecting the emergency lighting with an intensity that made them seem to glow from within. She wasn't just aware of my presence. She was waiting for me to understand something, to recognize a truth that was being offered in a language I was only beginning to learn. The dreams started that same night, vivid visions that felt more like memories than imagination. I was walking with Cassie through a field that stretched beyond any horizon, where the ground beneath our feet sparkled with starlight and the air hummed with music that came from everywhere and nowhere. Nova was with us, no longer the mysterious stray I'd found on that hill, but revealed as something larger and more luminous, a guide moving between worlds with the confidence of someone who belonged to both. In the dream, Cassie pointed toward constellations that formed and reformed above us, paying particular attention to one grouping that matched exactly the pattern burned into Nova's mouth. Her voice, when she spoke, carried across impossible distances with perfect clarity. "It wasn't your fault, Mom." I'm just farther now, but I can still hear you when you sing." I woke sobbing, my pillow soaked with tears I didn't remember shedding, and understood that Nova hadn't wandered into my life by accident. She was a messenger, a living bridge between the world of the bereaved and whatever realm had claimed my daughter. The howling wasn't random animal behavior, but purposeful communication, an attempt to maintain connection across distances that couldn't be measured in miles or light years. Over the following days, Nova's behavior became increasingly responsive to my emotional state. She would follow me from room to room, not with the anxious attachment of a dependent animal, but with the patient attentiveness of someone who knew important events were approaching and wanted to be present when they occurred. Her movements had purpose beyond simple companionship, as if she were positioning herself to receive or transmit signals that required precise alignment with forces I couldn't perceive. The validation I'd been unconsciously seeking arrived in the form of a man in a dark suit who appeared at my clinic on a Thursday afternoon when the October sky was the color of old pewter. He carried no identification, offered no business card, simply introduced himself as being from the Deep Atmospheric Anomalies Division, and asked if I'd noticed anything unusual about the dog I'd recently rescued. Every instinct I possessed told me to lie, to protect Nova from whatever agency this man represented. "She's just a stray with some behavioral quirks," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Nothing that can't be addressed with proper socialization and medical care." He studied my face with the kind of attention that suggested he could read deception as easily as I could read X-rays, then nodded slowly. "They're drawn to the sky, you know. Always have been. Some kind of biological imperative we don't fully understand. Sometimes they return with things inside them. Maps, codes, voices that shouldn't exist in terrestrial frequencies." He left without asking any follow-up questions, but his presence had been a warning wrapped in casual conversation. Someone knew about Nova, about what she represented and why she was important. Someone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. That night, as Nova performed her 3:33 a.m. ritual, something extraordinary occurred. As her howl reached its peak intensity, a single point of light appeared in the sky directly above the clinic. Not lightning or aircraft lighting, but something that pulsed once in response to her call before fading back into the darkness. The message was clear. Her communications were being received, acknowledged, answered by whatever intelligence existed in the spaces between stars. Unable to sleep after witnessing this impossible exchange, I retrieved Cassie's astronomy notebook from the box of belongings I'd been unable to face since her death. Page after page of meticulous star charts, mathematical equations, and observational notes filled with the passionate curiosity that had driven her to spend entire nights tracking celestial movements and searching for patterns in the cosmic background radiation. But it was the final page that made my hands shake as I held the notebook under the clinic's emergency lighting. A sketch of a white dog with stars floating above her head like a halo, drawn in Cassie's unmistakable style with careful attention to detail and proportion. Beneath the image, in her neat handwriting, was a message that felt like a letter delivered across impossible distances. "She carries the song. Let her sing." I looked up from the notebook to find Nova sitting directly in front of me, her pale eyes fixed on my face with an expression that seemed to hold infinite patience and love. For the first time since I'd found her, she approached close enough for physical contact, pressing her warm weight against my legs and allowing me to bury my fingers in her soft fur. "Are you the voice she heard?" I whispered, my words barely audible even in the clinic's profound silence. "Are you carrying messages from my daughter?" Nova blinked slowly, deliberately, then did something she'd never done before. She laid her head in my lap, closed her eyes, and fell into what appeared to be peaceful sleep. The first real rest I'd witnessed since she'd entered my life, as if my recognition of her true purpose had finally allowed her to lay down whatever burden she'd been carrying. As I sat there with this impossible creature sleeping trustingly against me, I began to understand that our connection transcended the normal boundaries between veterinarian and patient, between human and animal, between the living and whatever lay beyond life's conventional definitions. Nova wasn't just carrying star maps in her mouth. She was carrying my daughter's love, her determination to maintain connection even when traditional communication became impossible. The howling continued on subsequent nights, but it no longer felt like a sound of loss or longing. It had become a song of connection, a reminder that some bonds are strong enough to survive any distance, any transformation, any redefinition of what it means to exist. When I listened carefully during those 3:33 a.m. sessions, I could hear harmonics in Nova's vocalizations that sounded remarkably like Cassie's voice, as if my daughter were somehow singing along from whatever realm she now called home. The man in the dark suit returned several times over the following weeks, always with different questions but the same underlying agenda. He wanted Nova, wanted to study whatever technology or phenomenon allowed her to serve as a communication device between dimensions that shouldn't be able to touch each other. But each time he appeared, Nova would position herself between us and stare at him with such intensity that he would eventually leave without pursuing his objectives. She was protecting more than just herself. She was protecting the delicate channel that allowed love to flow between the world of the grieving and the realm of the departed, ensuring that the connection she'd been sent to establish couldn't be severed by those who would treat it as a scientific curiosity rather than a sacred gift. The star maps in her mouth continued to evolve, new patterns appearing and old ones shifting as if she were receiving updated navigation data from sources beyond our solar system. Dr. Yuppie. Morton called regularly, desperate to understand the astronomical significance of what I'd shown him, but I couldn't explain that the maps weren't meant for conventional scientific study. They were love letters written in the language of pulsars, messages that could only be decoded by hearts that had learned to listen beyond the frequencies of ordinary loss. As winter approached and the nights grew longer, Nova's nocturnal communications became more complex, incorporating multiple tones and rhythms that suggested she was participating in conversations rather than simply broadcasting distress signals. Sometimes, during the deepest part of these sessions, I would catch glimpses of light moving across the sky in patterns that seemed to respond to her vocalizations, as if the universe itself were acknowledging her messages and responding with confirmations of receipt. The dreams continued, growing more vivid and meaningful with each passing week. Cassie appeared regularly now, no longer as the grief-stricken teenager who died in that terrible accident, but as something more complete, more fully herself than she'd ever been constrained by physical form. She spoke of journeys through cosmic architectures I couldn't imagine, of lessons learned in spaces where consciousness could expand beyond the limitations of flesh and bone. But always, in every dream, she emphasized that love was the constant that connected all realities, the force that allowed communication to flow between dimensions that scientific understanding insisted were permanently separated. Nova was proof that such communication was possible, that the boundaries between life and death were more permeable than conventional wisdom suggested. One particularly clear night in late November, as Nova completed her ritual and the responding light pulsed its acknowledgement from the stars above, I finally understood what I was meant to do with this impossible gift. Not study it or exploit it or try to convince others of its reality, but simply treasure it, protect it, allow it to transform my understanding of what love could accomplish when freed from physical constraints. I stopped documenting Nova's behavior, stopped trying to capture evidence of her extraordinary nature. Instead, I focused on being present for whatever she was trying to teach me, on learning to read the languages of light and sound and celestial navigation that my daughter was using to maintain our connection across the vast distances that separated our current forms of existence. The clinic became a sanctuary where impossible things were not only possible, but sacred, where a stray dog could carry star maps in her mouth and no one would question the miracle of her presence. Nova had brought me more than just evidence that consciousness survived physical death. She'd brought me the certainty that love finds ways to persist, even when everything else falls away, that some bonds are strong enough to reshape reality itself rather than accept separation. Each night at 3:33 a.m., as Nova lifted her voice toward the stars and received her impossible responses, I would sit beside her and add my own quiet harmonies to her cosmic song. Not because I understood the technical aspects of interdimensional communication, but because I'd learned that some truths are meant to be felt rather than comprehended, experienced rather than explained. The silence that had once felt like abandonment had been revealed as anticipation, the quiet that comes before magnificent music begins. Nova had taught me to listen beyond grief, beyond the frequencies of ordinary loss, to the deeper currents that carry love between worlds, and ensure that no connection forged in genuine devotion can ever be permanently severed. When I looked up at the night sky now, I no longer saw emptiness or indifference. I saw a vast communication network where my daughter's voice traveled on stellar winds, where Nova's howls served as both transmission and reception equipment, where love had learned to speak in frequencies that transcended every limitation the physical world tried to impose on connection. The song continued, night after night, a reminder that some mysteries are too beautiful to solve, some gifts too precious to analyze, some love too strong to be contained by conventional understanding of life and death. Nova carried more than star maps in her mouth. She carried proof that the universe itself conspires to ensure that love finds ways to persist, to communicate, to bridge any distance that tries to keep devoted hearts apart.